Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, good people. We are so excited for today's show. We'll get into some introductions in a second, but we're going to take some time to welcome you to the show. So, thank you so much for showing up, whether you're joining us in real time on October 10th, 2024, or you're joining us in 2029. We're so excited to have you all today. So, today's topic, we're going to be talking about tools for building inclusive and intersectional LGBTQ plus environments and communities. And that's super important to me as a queer person. And we're going to talk more with our guests today. So before we hop into some introductions, let's get into some house rules. First things first, besides you being the realist, we would like to acknowledge our wonderful guests. So if there's something that really, really resonates with you, down at the bottom, you will see some emojis and some responding um, affirmations. So you'll see a heart, you'll see a hand clap, you will see some affirmations to let our speakers know that something they said was absolutely phenomenal, which we know it's going to be. Second, down at the bottom, you will see a closed captioning button, or you can use accessible tools in order to display that information up on the screen. Next, you will see or you will be able to locate a right button that says share. Please share this talk. Not only does it help us spread the message of how do we create a more inclusive world and space that's equitable and inclusive for all, but also to share that you've been a part of this professional development opportunity. There's so many nuggets that we know our guests are going to drop today, and we would love to share that wisdom. And so, now, without further ado, we will go into some introductions. So, thank you all for coming today to the show. Again, we'll be talking about tools for building inclusive intersectional LGBTQ plus environment. My name is Lee Miles. I use she and they pronouns, and I am one half of the Manifesting Inclusion co-founding team, where we are writing a book project that will be centered around building inclusive spaces. We've done some conference presentations. And last but not least, we have this series that is every single week, Thursday at 1 Eastern Standard Time. So, as we hop into who I am, a little bit about manifesting inclusion, we would love to pass it over to our first guest, Juliann, to introduce themselves, their pronouns, and what they do best.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Juliann. My pronouns are they, them. I am the assistant director at Rice University for LGBTQ plus thriving, which is probably my favorite title on my resume right now. um, in the spirit of intersectionality, I wanted to share some of my identities. So I'm non-binary, I'm transmasculine. Uh, and just to be a little TMI, I'm white. I was born and raised as a Jehovah's Witness in Alabama. And I learned that a medical condition that I was diagnosed with about 20 years ago, I just recently learned is also considered now one of the many things that qualifies as an intersex variation. So constantly learning about myself. I came out to myself as a lesbian when I was about 12, and then came out all over again as non-binary many years later at the age of 26, with innumerable coming outs in between those and since. Um, and I was drawn to higher ed work because I started out as a first generation college student and had no idea what I wanted to major in. So instead, I just distracted myself by getting involved in a lot of student engagement and involvement positions. And I was really energized with DEI work. I was a safe zone facilitator in the dorms. I was the on the student multicultural advisory committee. I was the student government secretary for diversity affairs, and then my last year I was finally the president of the Gay Straight Alliance. And I had some really beautiful, lovely mentors who looked at the work that I was doing and was like, "Did you know that you can do this as a career?" And so now, many years later, here I am.
Thank you so much, Julian, for sharing a little bit about yourself. Let's pass it over to Jennifer.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Williams. I use she and they pronouns. Either or is just fine. I describe myself as an educator, an artist, and a social entrepreneur, um, which social entrepreneur is really kind of a big word. That means that I have an opportunity to be a part of the change that I want to see in the world for a living, which is why being an educator and being creative about being an educator is something that's really important to me. Um, I fell into doing diversity work, I guess you could say, completely by accident, but it began with an interest in learning more about people. I grew up as a part of what I would call the MTV generation. And so Pedro Zamora, who was a cast member on one of the seasons of A Different World, made it his business to do a lot of education around HIV/AIDS. And that just enabled me to ask questions. It opened my eyes to, you know, what it was like to be Cuban in South Florida, which is has nothing to do with me. I shared none of those identities, but it opened the world to me and gave me an opportunity to just ask questions about, well, how do people who are different from me live, and how does that impact me? What happens when our worlds collide? Years later, when I would come to graduate school at North Carolina Central University, I was late to, yes, Eagle Pride amplified. I was late to class one day, and we were being divided up into groups to do some type of research project on learning more about people who were different from us. It was diverse issues in counseling. My background is in mental health, and the last group that was taking people into their group was the group that was studying um, transgender relationships, or relationships with trans people where um, the couples were married and one member of the couple began to transition while they were married. I don't even know how we got there. Again, I was late to class, but it led me down this amazing rabbit hole to just again ask questions about, like, okay, so, well, what does this mean, and how does this change your life, and how does this impact your family? And of course, when you start asking questions about other people, if you're doing it right, I believe it gives you an opportunity to also ask questions about yourself. And what does this mean for me? And how have I interacted with people from this community in the past? Wow, I really made some big missteps. And when I encounter more people from this community, how can I be a better person to them, a better community member to folks who may be going through this and you don't even know it? And so that was really how I kind of got into doing work within queer communities, that led me to becoming one of the to being able to help to establish NCCU's LGBT Resource Center. I worked as the GA for a really long time, until for a while, until I graduated, and then I came back and I helped to found the Department of Diversity and Inclusion. Of course, the name of that department has changed, and now it's the Department of Student Development and Support, which, if you are doing the work right, you are helping to develop and support students of varying identities. And so um, I really enjoy my work because it gives me an opportunity to continue to learn more about people. Um, I still teach classes, and I also currently serve as the director of the Women's Center here at NCCU. There's so many opportunities that are afforded to me, and each and every one of them pay me in a way because I am able to learn more about people from all walks of life, and I enjoy that.
Thank you both so much for sharing. Something that really resonated with me that you both said is that there was this experience, like this catalyst that either made you think more about yourself or more about how yourself interacts with other people. And so I think one of those huge places was first, um, the first time I interacted with this was thinking about coming out. So I always knew I was a little bit gay as a youngster, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't feel bi. I didn't feel like this super butch lesbian. I didn't really know what that meant. And so I want to dig a little bit into some of these pieces of just community building and support around that, right? So I was in college, I think the first time I was like, okay, this isn't just like a thing, it's like who I am. But I also think about I had some financial aid types of issues that really impacted my ability to matriculate. I had some social identity pieces that I had to work through. But all that goes to say is, what are some experiences that you all have had supporting LGBTQ students on a college campus? And what does that climate look like today and some of the resources that they would need to be successful? And I'll start off with Juliann and then we'll go to Jennifer.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think I think the things that affect students in their day to day matter significantly. With trans students, people are going to use your name every day. With all of us, you're going to use the bathroom every day, and those are two places where LGBTQ folks, gender nonconforming, trans, and others can experience really extreme discomfort and challenges. So with places where you hopefully you're updating your systems to allow people to update to their chosen names, and then making sure that all the departments within your entity are pulling from that list instead of still defaulting to perhaps legal name markers. That can be really helpful in just not adding to misgendering for people. um, and there's some really interesting research for those of us who work with students and young adults. There's some very compelling data that students who are able to use their chosen name in all areas of life have 71% less instances of severe depression and something like 65% fewer incidents of suicidality. Um, Massive impact on well-being. With bathrooms, I'll use a personal narrative of a friend of mine. He felt so uncomfortable as a trans man using shared bathroom spaces and was at a campus that did not have gender inclusive restrooms, that he would not use the restroom all day. And it resulted in some pretty severe health issues regularly for him. So those are the two big ones that I think are top of mind for me.
Thank you so much for that. Let's go over to you, Jen.
Yeah, thank you. Some of the first things that come to mind for me are the mental health implications for it and providing support for students who may not necessarily be supported at home, or they're just struggling in finding community. And so, in establishing the LGBTA Resource Center, initially, as I mentioned, I was a graduate student. And so it was really hard for me to just kind of wrap my head around, like, well, what do you mean you don't have any support from your parents? Because that was not, my experience. Um, and so to have the opportunity to really companion students initially in the earlier years through the process of, like, okay, look, what is it to navigate this process and not have the support of family, then finding family, establishing a chosen family, and then a network of resources that are going to help you to make sure that you're able to cover your tuition, to make sure that you're able to secure housing, that you're going to have housing in those in between times. So the summer, and then the break in between. So if you're going to attend classes for the summer, that 2 to 3, sometimes month-long period in between when classes end at the end of the spring semester and then start again. So, there are all these little cracks, these little loopholes where people may find themselves in, where initially that may not necessarily be something that you think about, like, oh, this is what it is to support a student. So sometimes taking for granted that those things are automatically provided for, and they're not. Um, then also making sure that there's food. One of the things that I really enjoyed about doing this work, of course, is like the community building work. So the sharing actual love, being human with people. That was really, for me in the beginning, a really transformative experience. And to bring, as a graduate student, I was in my late 20s at the time, to bring in, um, bring people home with me for Christmas. That was something I had never done. And so not everyone grew that I brought home with me grew up Christian. So to like prepare my family, like, okay, let's um I'm bringing somebody who grew up different from us um home. And so like just preparing them for, like, okay, they may not necessarily be accustomed to this kind of thing. So, having conversations with my family, like, but also um in some of those conversations with people um, who may have grown up different, or being introduced to new situations, whether they were my family or they were faculty and staff members, drawing connections between, like, okay, so what are we about? What is our ethos really about? Underlining that has always been a strength of mine. And then also, bringing that back to be able to say, okay, well, this is why we are shifting things, because this is who we say we are. This is who we say what we say we're about. And if this is truly who we are, then we want to make sure that we are supporting our students or supporting our community members. And that's why it's important to make these policy changes. So it can start with very small ways of just seeing someone's humanity, and then expanding to make sure that we're taking care of people.
For sure. What I'm really hearing is this piece about humanity work, right? So, as much as we want to think about, wow, I want to support the student, and wow, I want to support them in their salient identity, right? The one that might seem like it's most important to them at this point in life. It's really, do you have food? Do you have water? As your Maslow's hierarchy of needs being met, do you have psychological safety? Do you have physical safety? And so, a part of in thinking about these groups and manifesting inclusion is just to also manifest humanity. And so I wanted you all to think about what are some of those positive, maybe programs that you've seen that have really supported queer and trans folks, right? And I'm using that as a general umbrella, though folks might not personally identify. But what are some of those programs that you've either seen be really, really successful? Or not? And then also, what are the components that make that successful? So, is it funding? Is it a personnel line? What does that look like? And we'll go with Julianne first.
Ooh, what a good question. um, so I think I think I'm going to start with talking about knowing the population that you're serving. One of the things that I've observed is that sometimes SOGI data, the sexual orientation and gender identity information that we include in most surveys, sometimes isn't fully up to date or used in effective ways. And that can really be informative to helping us understand what population we're working with and what their needs are. Um, the other thing that comes to mind is even once you do that, you've got to build trust with the LGBTQ folks in your network. Not everyone is out. Not everyone feels comfortable putting their name on a list that might fall into the wrong hands at some point. So, working to build trust and let people give you full feedback of their experience and their needs in safe and protected ways is crucial. Um, Lastly, I think somebody touched on this a minute ago, but yes, we got to focus on making sure the basic needs are met. There's a lot of insecurity in the LGBTQ community for some of those baseline housing, um, food, it's psychological safety, etc. But also like finding those ways to celebrate the things that are less visible. whiteness gets centered a lot in LGBTQ programming. And I'm currently in Houston, Texas, and we're a very diverse city, which is incredible to be a part of. So I'm going to give a shout out to something we're doing a little later today, actually. Um, we're currently in the timeline intersection of Latina History Month and LGBTQ History Month. And there's a really wonderful artist named Felix Dion, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. But he has made a beautiful LGBTQ version of Loteria. And Loteria is, a very traditional, fun game for the Latina and Hispanic community. But he's added some additional cards, such as the Muxe, which is a third gender that has a very long history of being both recognized and celebrated in southern Mexico. And bringing that visibility and like some possibility modeling to students where they may not otherwise have it, I think that's crucial.
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Um, so when I think about ways that we have been able to like really make sure that our queer population feels at home on NCCU's campus, I want to touch a little bit on what Julianne mentioned um, in talking about making sure that people feel safe. And so one of the things that NCCU did prior to me coming to the campus was to create a group of faculty and staff who were queer. And not everybody in the group was queer, but a good deal of them were. So there were also supporters in the group and allies. That group was called Polychromes. And one of the things that was pointed out about the group was that it was overwhelmingly white. And of course, NCCU is an HBCU campus. But in creating the group, it allowed for conversation to happen. So why is the group white on an HBCU campus? Why don't we have Black or other folks of color on this campus who feel comfortable in coming out and being a part of a group or putting their name on a list, as Julianne mentioned? And so that allowed for NCCU and the folks who were doing the work at that particular point in time to ask some questions of themselves. Um, and to further further piggyback on some of what Julianne said, some of the work that came out of that was to, have further conversations with Black queer students, faculty, and staff. Like, okay, well, so what do you need? What do you need to feel comfortable? And sometimes the work can be just that simple, just having the conversation. Okay, tell us what to change. And I think establishing that trust and establishing those lines of communication will be something that will very much so serve the initiative long term. So establishing those lines of communication, making sure that they're shored up with trust and that it's a continuing relationship that's sustained over time. Those are really important things to do. Um, Starting those lines of communication eventually led to us having our homecoming drag show. A homecoming drag show is, first of all, homecoming is always a good time. But then you throw a drag show on top of that, you really cannot go wrong. And so again, it's creating space for not only celebration of self, celebration of identity, but then also you're inviting other folks in and we're having conversations about prep and pep and who's impacted by this. And so the hundreds and thousands of people who are attending our homecoming drag shows who may not have normally heard about what is prep, what is pep. Now they're in there learning. And so as an educator, as an educator, mixing education and entertainment is something you have to get good at. and creating conversation. And so I know that, after we had those programs, those were opportunities for people to go home and do some Googles and talk about, okay, well, is PrEP something that can benefit me? Is PEP something that can benefit me? And that's just one instance. And we've been doing it now, I want to say, uh, maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe more. I don't know. But now our homecoming drag show is now a homecoming drag brunch. And it is, something that we kick off homecoming with. It is well attended. We had to move it so because some of our student leaders, like on Royal Court, were not able to attend because it always conflicted with something else. So we had to move it, but we moved it because more people wanted to come. And so it's just a good time. It's a good time. It's a good time for learning. It's a good time to celebrate culture and to learn. And yeah, if you build it, they will come.
So let's hop in and talk about that in a second. So I've personally had different experiences. I worked at Ivy League institutions. I worked at public institutions. I currently work at a private institution, and there seems to be this thought that okay, if we do the little DEI thing, we've met everyone's needs, right? So if we have a little sprinkle of something for LGBTQ folks, then we're done. Can we dig a little bit into the intersectionality and why those spaces matter? So, even within these identities that people identify with, why does it matter that it's a layered experience and we meet those needs for those groups? And either one of you all can go.
Okay. I'll go ahead and hop in here. It matters because as we we're working with students now who have grown up with um, being able to see themselves reflected or complaining when they don't see themselves reflected. Um, we, as educators who are also in the business of customer service, must take care of our customers. That also means that we have to take care of their families because their families have loaned us their babies. And their babies want to see them, want to know that they matter. They, if we are preparing our students for what the world is going to look like on the other side of this educational experience, then we need to let them know not only it's okay to be who you are, but then also how do you handle yourself in different types of spaces? How do you handle yourselves in when you come into contact with people who are different from you? How do you handle yourself, remain respectful, and also honor the people that you share space and community with? And if you need to ask a question, how do you ask a question in a way that is going to allow for you to build the bridge as opposed to be offensive or offending? um, I think as we have, I guess you could say, kind of shifted away from like the label of DEI work. One of the things that we've been talking more and more about, I do this in my classes, and we're even focusing it more on within my division, which is the Division of Student Affairs. We're talking about the 8 dimensions of wellness. Okay, and so if I want to make sure that my customer is taken care of, and you live on my campus, you eat on my campus, I'm preparing you for tomorrow. We have to have conversations around financial security and why your financial security might your plan for financial security might look different from this other person's plan for financial security. There are going to be other things that you need to consider. If we're talking about your occupational wellness, and we're planning out, we're mapping out possibilities, and it's okay to change your mind when you get there because things may change and you have to be flexible. You have to learn how to pivot. then we have to talk about what it's going to look like for you specifically. And then again, if you're going to be working with other people who are different from you, why might their path look different? If I'm doing my job as an educator, I'm going to make sure that we've had conversations that are going to prepare you for working with people who are similar but different, or any amalgamation of what that might look like for anyone. I think if you're going to be a good educator, you have to be prepared for those conversations.
Thanks. That was great. I think to piggyback on the how do we become great educators, great practitioners, we are lifelong learners, right? And to reference what Lee was saying about sometimes there's a checkbox mentality around DEI, I think something similar happens with the LGBTQ community period as well. So for folks who are maybe a little earlier in learning about the LGBTQ community, I would encourage them to maybe stop thinking about it as a whole bucket. There's so much diversity just within those letters. And also pause on thinking that there's universal rules for how to navigate supporting LGBTQ folks, because the nuances of each of those letters, and then most of those letters are umbrella terms for a whole slew of other identities underneath them that have their own nuances as well. A couple of things that are popping into my mind right now are things like um, bisexual invisibility in the community, because intra community allyship is necessary and crucial too. We got to support the letters that we don't necessarily hold. Femme, lesbian, erasure, and even as we're constantly talking about LGBTQ, there's a whole bunch of identities that aren't even included in the acronym that we're using, like two spirit, same gender loving, intersex, asexual, aromantic, and so much more. So as we continue in our learning path as lifelong learners, I think it's really important for people to zoom in on those specific identities and the lived experiences of specific identities. And then, even further, how religion and gender and age and uh, region of origin and language impact all of those identities even further, and that can help us understand ways to be much more thoughtful and purposeful to meet those individuals' needs without putting the labor on them to constantly be telling us what it is they need. Because to be honest, at I mean, I've been out for I've been self-aware of my own identities for a very long time. I'm still learning how to articulate what I need, right? So I'll just hit the mute button on that.
I want to touch base for a second. So we know some folks might be early on their journey, or might just be like WTF, right? So when we mention things like femme or lesbian or erasure, we're speaking to specifically in that example what happens when I'm a femme presenting lesbian and or not, and people don't see me as being queer because of how I look. People don't see me as not liking um, the opposite gender, as we sometimes say, but putting people in a box that that's what they like, that they specifically want to be in this heterosexual relationship. And though we know that things like race play into that and religion play into that, the erasure part means, okay, well, okay, whatever for you, because you just don't look like it, right? So we have our classic examples in the 90s where we had rappers like Debrat, right? And so that was one of right, Jay? That was one of the ones that coming up, I was looking at Queen Latifah and Setting It Off and the Brat, and I was like, that's not quite me, right? I didn't feel like a Rosie O'Donnell or a Ellen DeGeneres. I didn't see myself being presented. And so that erasure part often means that there's a piece that's being removed, much like we do with folks that enter and they identify as being multicultural, multiracial, or coming from a low social economic background, and then they acquire money and wealth, and there's this erasure about ideology, right? But I also want to touch base on religion because you all are in the South, right? And so we whew, we often talk about this Southern piece specifically and how we have this intersection of religion. And with both of you all and myself being a part of this, I would love if you could share your story or maybe a couple tidbits just about what that has looked like for you or in people in the community. And as you're thinking about that, I just want to shout out a couple comments. We had DeMarcus, thank you so much for joining. He said, it's so important and yet brave practice to engage self introspection, which gets to what we're talking today, while also navigating those aspects of grace, growth, humanity, and accountability. Nakia, thank you for joining us today. Said that we are so excited for this conversation. Love, love, love learning from Juliann. Their ideation meets passion and skills, and excited to meet the other learn from Jennifer, who we love so much. We've got Dr. Allen who said, "Hey." Um, and we've got another comment from DeMarcus who says, understanding how we come to understand ourselves is so key. So let's hop back into the faith based conversation and also the religion conversation. What was your experience and how have you witnessed the intersection of that climate? And we'll start with, let's go with you, Julianne, since you said that you're a Jehovah's Witness. Let's start with that story.
Well, I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. I'll put that out there. Um, so talking about the intersection of the South and religion is also like its own thing. And I want to drop a little fun fact real quick because I love data. The Southeast United States has the greatest ratio of LGBTQ people to population out of any region in the country. So we are queer and we are here. Okay. I flipped it around, but you know what I meant. Uh, yeah, religion is tricky and complicated. When when I was growing up in that environment, I early on had a lot of connection to the virtues I was being taught. I had a lot of self-esteem from being good in my religion. And so when I realized who I was at such a young age, and like 6 months after I'd gotten baptized, um, I had a real crisis of conscience. I went into pray it away mode for a long time, and and really pushed parts of myself down. And I was thinking about this recently because I, based on that framework of faith, I was like, I'm either lying about who I am, which is a sin, or I'm being who I am, which is also a sin. Like I can't win. And it made me take a step back and really think about on a deeper level the core of what I had been taught and how I connected with it. And I mean, it has been a lifelong journey. For a while, as one of my friends calls it, the church hurt was a little too much, and I needed to just kind of step away in general. I'm now in a place where I'm re-exploring spirituality in a more broad sense, and it's kind of fun because I feel like a lot of a lot of LGBTQ community has popped up on TikTok over the pandemic years. And so I've discovered a lot more connection with folks who are exploring maybe some zodiac or some like connection to nature things that has been meaning building for me. But I'm going to pivot back to a broader experience of being in the South. So I'm around students who are constantly going through journeys similar to mine, but then also in different faith systems. And I do have a lot of privilege being in Houston because we have such a diverse city here. So there's a number of religious organizations that do LGBTQ outreach, and I've been able to network across those groups, and leaning into the people who are doing that work has allowed me to kind of or cooperate with them and collaborate to make sure that I'm bringing those resources to the students that need them.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll pass it over to Jen.
Okay. So October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I have on a shirt representing one of my student orgs, the Purple Heart, who do a lot of peer education around domestic violence and intimate partner violence on our campus. And I mention that because When I say I grew up in the church, I do mean 7 days a week. My church was also my school. Saturday was choir practice, orchestra practice, and of course, there's at least 30 days of revival during the summer. So, church. My graduating class was 29 people deep. And so, when I left home, and I attended East Carolina University for undergraduate, um, I'd been around white people, but never that many. And never, it had been a really long time since I had had the experience of being a minority, I guess you could say. And so one of the things that I sought out was, well, okay, well, where are the black people at? So I tried to find places where people were playing spades. And I tried to find places where the gospel choir was, because that's what I know. So um, I in the gospel choir, was playing spades was just fun. It was just a social thing, just kind of come as you are. But in the gospel choir, that's where I found all the queer folks. That's where I found all the black queer folks. Okay, that was home. That was family. I wasn't allowed to date growing up. And so I looked at leaving home as not only escaping uh, the domestic violence that I grew up in, but also as an opportunity to just finally just kind of breathe and to figure out who I was. And so, as Juliann mentioned, the LGBTQ stuff and how each of those letters is really an umbrella term for so many other identities. I had thought about in theory where I fit into those different categories. Well, is lesbian it? I don't think so. I don't think that's really is bi it. Well, some of that doesn't really fit me either. And of course, I'm looking at what it has been represented on television as well. Um, and really to have the freedom and the opportunity to meet other queer folks in gospel choir, and just to kind of see how they live their life gave me an opportunity to just kind of figure it out on my own. So what things would look like for me, and really kind of personalize it. Um, and I, it was, I stayed in gospel choir maybe 2.5 years. I didn't say the entire time I was there, but it was really a transformative experience, because I got to do something that I wanted to do and hold on to parts of um, religiousness and church and stuff like that that I enjoyed and that were helpful to me. The community of it, of course, the music of it, like the musicality of it, like those pieces that meant a lot to me. And then also just kind of pick and choose. I don't think I really want to do this anymore. That didn't really serve me as much as other people who got out of it, and just kind of pick and choose what was going to be good for me. And so today, um, I've reached a point where I'm grateful for the way that I grew up, because when I connect with other folks um, who have a similar experience, like we're speaking the same language. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I can understand what you mean when you start talking about church hurt. I also have an understanding in a way that I'm able to connect with lots of different people who may come from religious backgrounds. Okay, I know what this is, because it's something that I, fairly versed in. So it allows for me to um, to help and connect with other people, but also understand people in various ways. I think it's important when you are doing your healing work to take your time and reconcile things as you need to. And everybody's journey is not going to be the same.
I want to take a couple moments and highlight a little bit of history. So, as we're entering this History Month, sometimes we think that these queering or trans ideologies are new. But the reality is this exists everywhere in the animal kingdom. So I just want to read off a couple of facts that you all can look at, and this is from a website, and I'll make sure that I post it in the chat. And so, a couple of things in 1649, we had one of the first convictions of lesbian activity here in North America. There was an individual named Sarah White Norman, and she had lewd behavior with another individual named Mary Vincent Hammond, and that was in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And so, with this conviction, that actually created a lot of anti homosexuality at the time that was looked at, I don't want to say underground, but not as something that was tangible, right? We've also got the one of the largest lasting gay organizations in 1950, and that was formed in Los Angeles. I'm going to go forward a little bit. In 1962, Illinois became the first U.S. state to remove sodomy law. So previously, just in that 1600s piece, it was thought to be sodomy between two people. We had our first gay liberation march that was held in New York City. Then we had the Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who created the street activist movement, which at the time we don't use that language as much anymore, but it was STAR, which stands for Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, which we now think of the Stonewall movement, right? And moving beyond into Harvey Milk. And then I actually want to go forward. In 2014, the Department of Education issues official guidance to clarify what happens with transgender students and what is prohibited and protected under Title IX. And then in 2015, we had, 2016, President Obama dedicated Stonewall National Monument Day in Greenwich Village, which is in Manhattan. And so, in between this history, the reason why I mentioned that is because law has always had a long standing history. So, we sometimes think about social activists, right? Like James Baldwin, who, if you did not know, was openly and privately gay at that time. He was a novelist and an intellectual who's thought a lot around his novel, which is Giovanni's Room. If you've never read that, please do. Then we had Bayard Rustin, who was a civil rights activist and a man that worked a lot on the March on Washington. And so we've always had these silent voices that really contributed a lot to history. And I just want to mention that to give you all a timeline that we've been fighting this now for 600 years in the North American context. I want to give a time really quickly as we transition into some question and answer, that if you have some comments, please leave them in the chat. We had Jennifer, who we had early talking about neurodiversity a couple months ago, who said, ooh, yes, everything you're saying about religious trauma and exploring other forms of spirituality. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Julianne. I think we can all resonate with that. But if you have other comments, please drop them in the chat here below. I also want to recognize that we have a little bit of addition to the history in a second, but we have a lot of folks that have been impacted by war, by these hurricanes that have happened. And so we would love to take a moment of silence before we hop into some comments and also some question and answer. So. Thank you all so much. So if you have questions or other comments, please drop them in the chat and we'll be sure to answer them. But Julianne, you want to add a little bit more to the history piece as well?
Yeah, so for North America, this is one of my favorite things to talk about with transness is many of the indigenous communities in North America also had multiple genders included in their societies. And while we don't have records of all of them, a number of colonizer diaries do include those records. And so, like, literally from before the United States even existed in North America, this has been part of it. So.
Thank you so much for mentioning that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we try to say that this is a new problem, but it's like, well, this has existed in its natural state and also in an inclusive state around different cultures of the world for decades and centuries. And so, though those might not be as knowledgeable, it goes to that erasure part, right? It goes to um, that common civility that we think that if we don't see it, it doesn't exist. And so, thank you so much for adding that. I'm going to check and see if we have any questions or extra comments. We don't at this time, but thank you all. What else would you all like to share before we get off today? Are there any other comments that you all would like to share about advocacy or organizations to look at, or how people can be true allies and advocates to the community?
Yeah, I've got one thing that I really wanted to talk about today, because I don't know if it gets mentioned as much, but there's a lot of connection between the neurodiverse community and the LGBTQ community. The main piece of data that's really well verified is that the autistic community has much higher rates of being LGBTQ and gender nonconforming. And I'm going to give a shout out to my previous boss when I was at the UH LGBTQ Resource Center. She was really thoughtful about making sure our programming served that population as well. So even our events that were like live and dynamic, we made sure that there was some space on the side that was a little quieter to allow people who might have gotten a little overstimulated to kind of decompress. Um, Obviously, fidget spinners and things like that can be helpful, but they're, as you're designing spaces, you can keep in mind having different types of furniture present, standing desks, different types of chairs. And then the last one that I think is really important and easy for anyone to do is if you have an event, especially with students where you're trying to help them build community, that can be really overwhelming for folks. And so we would make sure that we published an overview of event information of what is happening at one time so people can expect what is happening. And then also make sure that we had some volunteers working that were at the front door to greet people and help bring them into the spaces and help them introduce to other people as needed, to make it a less intimidating environment. And while I was at the University of Houston, we got a lot of good feedback from our students on that.
Sorry, y'all. I was on mute. I'm so sorry. But thank you so much, Jennifer, for making a comment in the chat that said, I'm so grateful for the work you all are doing to co create safer spaces for next generations. And then also, thank you for their inclusion. So I'm thinking about myself being a part of that statistic, Julianne. Is for real. What other comments do you have for us, Jennifer, before we dip out today?
As I mentioned, the only thing that comes to mind at the moment, because I'm on my way to another program now. Again, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I think I'm glad that we have an opportunity to talk about that at this particular moment, because a lot of times when we're talking to our student groups or even their families, they think about DV as something that occurs within the confines of a cisgender heterosexual relationship where a man is beating on a woman. So much more than that. So much more than that. And I think that if you are doing this work and you're working with LGBT folks, you also have to think about how it may be showing up within the queer community as well. We do a lot of trainings with our police on campus. They've been very receptive. That's not just um, that's not just the roommate spat. That is a whole lover's quarrel, and so it can show up in a lot of different ways. Beyond that, it can show up within families, and so just be aware, be mindful as you talk about these topics this month, um, that it happens to a lot of different types of people in a lot of different other situations than what we typically think of initially. And that's all I have.
Oh, so thank you so much for sharing your nuggets of wisdom. I'm sorry, y'all, the mute button is not unmuting today. But Julianne, where can we find you and where can we connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. My handle is Juliann Losey. I think I'm the only one. You can also follow my Instagram that I'm using for this position, which is Instagram at LGBTQ plus thriving.
And Jennifer, where can we find you?
You can always find me on LinkedIn. I am Jennifer M. Williams, 80s baby, a very popular name, but I'm Jennifer. I'm the only Jennifer with this face. So there's that.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we close out, if you're enjoying this, please join one of our upcoming streams. We are here most Thursdays. Our next talk will be next Thursday. We'll be talking about HBCU inclusion, and so that's going to be a great talk with some other Eagle alum that come from NCCU. And then our following chats will be thinking about how do we think about inclusion and equity in those education spaces. So K through 12, higher ed, and nonprofit. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure to have you both, and we can't wait to see you all, whether you're watching this live or after next week or on our next stream.